For the 10th time, my father-in-law declared my marriage was the biggest mistake of his life. He assumed I would stay silent and keep wiring his $20,000 monthly allowance to preserve his arrogant, washed-up ego. I cut the funding that very afternoon. 7 days later, a call from Arizona stunned the entire Whitaker family. Mr. Grant Whitaker used his daughter-in-law's name to guarantee a $2.8 million bridge loan that is currently defaulting. My name is Violet Parker. At 38 years old, I sit at the helm of Northvale Operating Group as its founder and chief executive officer. It was late Tuesday afternoon, the kind of hour where the Seattle skyline turns a bruised shade of violet, and the office hums with the quiet intensity of closing business. I was in the middle of reviewing a highly contested acquisition file for a boutique hotel property in Charleston. The numbers on the pro forma were tight, requiring my absolute focus. The margins were razor thin, the capital expenditures were heavy, and I was looking for the exact line item where the current management was bleeding cash. Then, my private line rang. The caller identification screen flashed a name that instantly tightened the muscles in my jaw. Grant Whitaker, my father-in-law. I let it ring 3 times before pressing the speaker button. I did not stop running my gold pen down the column of projected revenues. "Violet," Grant said. His voice was loud, carrying the unmistakable, loose-lipped resonance of a man who had been drinking expensive Cabernet Sauvignon since noon. Behind him, I could hear the ambient noise of a high-society Napa Valley fundraiser. There was the clinking of crystal wine glasses, the hum of privileged laughter, and a string quartet playing something aggressively classical in the background. "Hello, Grant," I replied, my tone flat, carefully stripped of any irritation. "Is there an emergency?" "An emergency is a matter of perspective," he scoffed, the syllables slurring just enough to betray him. "I am at the Oakville charity auction. I need you to wire an additional $50,000 to my secondary account by tomorrow morning. I am bidding on a private villa stay in Tuscany, and my current limit is suddenly becoming an inconvenience." I stopped my pen. I looked at the speakerphone. "You received your standard $20,000 disbursement on the 1st of the month. Grant, that was exactly 4 days ago." "That paltry sum barely covers my essential overhead," he snapped, his voice dropping into a register of aristocratic offense. "I am a Whitaker. I have a certain standard to uphold. I need to maintain the family image in these circles. People expect me to participate. Violet, they expect me to lead." "The family image," I repeated, tasting the bitter irony of the phrase. "The image that you are still the reigning king of Blue Alder resorts, rather than a man who was quietly forced out of his own boardroom." A heavy, jagged silence fell over the line. I had struck the nerve, the one unspoken truth that the entire family danced around at every Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner. "You listen to me, you arrogant little bean counter," Grant hissed, the veneer of the wealthy patriarch instantly peeling away to reveal the bitter, frightened old man underneath. "I built an empire while you were still trying to figure out how to read a balance sheet. And I will tell you this right now. I told Owen it was the biggest mistake of my life letting him marry you." There it was, the 10th time. I had kept a mental tally over the 11 years of my marriage to his son. The first time was at our rehearsal dinner. The third time was when I refused to co-sign a catastrophic commercial lease for him. The 7th time was when I politely declined to hire his mistress as a consultant at Northvale. And now, the 10th time, because I had the audacity to question a $50,000 impulsive demand for a charity auction. I did not yell. I did not slam my hand on the mahogany desk. I felt a strange, absolute stillness wash over me, cold and clarifying, like stepping into a freezing river. "Grant," I said, leaning closer to the microphone, "I am going to ask you one question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Are you absolutely certain you want to stand by that statement? Is that your final, considered opinion on my place in this family?" He laughed. It was a cruel, dismissive sound that echoed through the phone. He thought I was yielding. He thought this was my way of begging for his approval, of trying to preserve the sacred family harmony that his wife Eleanor always preached about. He thought I was just a subordinate waiting for his validation. "I stand by every single word," he declared, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think you are so powerful with your little operating group, but let me make one thing crystal clear to you, Violet. Every door that has ever opened for you, every ounce of success you think you have achieved, it only has value because it is attached to the Whitaker name. Without us, without my legacy, you are just a girl from the suburbs playing corporate dress-up. Send the money. Do not make me ask twice." He ended the call. The dial tone hummed through my office. I sat back in my leather chair. The Whitaker name, his legacy, he had entirely forgotten, or deliberately chosen to ignore, the reality of our financial architecture. He had forgotten that his grand legacy was currently propped up by a shadow structure I had engineered. When the board of Blue Alder Resorts ousted him for gross mismanagement and borderline embezzlement 5 years ago, Owen had come to me, almost in tears, begging me to help his father save face. I was the one who fabricated the title of Chairman Emeritus. I was the one who drafted the severance structure that looked like an honorable retirement. And most importantly, I was the one privately funding his $20,000 a month honorarium through a sanitized corporate vehicle, just so Grant Whitaker could continue to walk into his country clubs without his credit cards bouncing. I picked up the receiver and dialed an internal extension. David, the chief financial officer of Northvale, answered on the first ring. "David speaking. David, I need you to execute an immediate stop on the Chairman Emeritus retainer," I said. My voice was entirely steady. There was a brief pause on the line. David knew exactly what that retainer was and who it funded. "Just to be clear, Violet, you mean the monthly disbursement to Grant Whitaker?" "Yes, terminated entirely. Not suspended. Terminated. Furthermore, I want his corporate country club membership revoked effective immediately. Cancel the black card issued under the secondary holding company, shut down his access to the private concierge account, and decline any pending personal expense reimbursements attached to his name. That is going to trigger a significant cascade of rejected charges by tomorrow morning," David noted, his tone turning highly professional. "Are we prepared for the blowback? Let it cascade," I replied. "Also, get accounting on the line. I want a complete freeze on all off-budget disbursement requests from the family trust account. I have been managing that fund quietly for years, and as of this exact second, the vault is sealed. Nobody draws a single dollar without my direct, written, wet ink authorization. Is that understood?" "Crystal clear. I will have the stop payments processed before close of business today." "Thank you, David." I hung up the phone. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. The city lights were beginning to flicker on against the gathering dusk. For years, I had swallowed my pride. I had absorbed Grant's insults, Eleanor's passive-aggressive remarks, and Owen's constant pleas for me to just keep the peace. I had paid an exorbitant premium, both emotionally and financially, to maintain the illusion of a functional, prestigious family. I had been afraid of the noise, afraid of the messy public fallout that would occur if I ever let the facade drop. But sitting there in the quiet of my office, surrounded by the tangible proof of the empire I had built with my own hands, I realized something profound. I felt an overwhelming, intoxicating sense of liberation. The silence in the room was no longer oppressive. It was not something to be feared. It felt remarkably like the heavy, suspended moment right before the foundation of a rotten, condemned building finally begins to crack. The wrecking ball had just swung, and all I had to do now was sit back and watch the dust rise. I picked up my gold pen, turned my attention back to the Charleston Hotel acquisition file, and crossed out the current management's budget with one hard, decisive stroke. It was exactly 8:30 the following morning when the heavy oak front door of my Mercer Island home swung open with the force of a localized hurricane. Eleanor Whitaker did not knock. She never did. She marched into the grand foyer wearing her signature pearls, an immaculate cashmere cardigan, and a look of absolute, unadulterated fury. I was seated at the marble kitchen island, quietly reviewing a set of quarterly reports over a cup of black coffee. The morning light cast long, sharp shadows across the room, perfectly matching the sudden drop in temperature her arrival brought. "By what right?" Eleanor demanded, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. She slammed her designer handbag onto the counter, narrowly missing my tablet. "By what conceivable right do you dare freeze the family accounts? Violet Grant called me in an absolute state last night. His card was declined at a charity dinner. He was humiliated." I did not flinch. I carefully set my ceramic mug down on a coaster. "Good morning to you, too. Eleanor, would you like some coffee?" "Do not patronize me," she snapped, stepping closer. Her hands were actually trembling with indignation. "You reverse that decision immediately. You have no authority to cut off his rightful pension. That is the family's money. It is his legacy. He built Blue Alder Resorts from the ground up." I looked at her for a long, silent moment. Eleanor had spent her entire life wrapping herself in the comfortable illusion of her husband's greatness. She genuinely believed the narrative they had sold to their country club friends. It was time to pull the curtain down. I stood up, walked into my adjacent home office, and retrieved a thick black leather-bound binder from the bottom drawer of my desk. It was heavy, weighted with over a decade of financial truths. I walked back into the kitchen and dropped it onto the marble island right in front of her. The sound it made was like a judge bringing down a gavel. "Open it," I instructed, my voice flat and entirely devoid of emotion. Eleanor stared at the binder as if it were a venomous snake. "What is this nonsense? That is the family legacy you are screaming about," I said, leaning forward slightly. "Go ahead, open it. Eleanor, look at the tabs. I have spent the last 11 years of my life quietly cleaning up after your husband. Look at Section 2. That is the timeline of wire transfers I personally authorized to save him from margin calls. Section 4 outlines the exact legal fees I paid out of my own pocket to settle those catastrophic vendor lawsuits he triggered 5 years ago. Section 5 details the emergency liquidity I pumped into his failed real estate ventures so he would not have to declare personal bankruptcy." Eleanor's hand hovered over the cover, her previous righteous anger suddenly faltering against the sheer volume of paper in front of her. "And then," I continued, my tone growing sharper, "we get to the grand illusion, the $20,000 a month you call his rightful pension. Do you want to know the truth about the chairman emeritus title? Eleanor." She swallowed hard, her eyes darting between my face and the black binder. "There is no pension," I told her, delivering the words with surgical precision. "When the board of directors forced Grant out of the executive suite 5 years ago, they were prepared to throw him to the curb with absolutely nothing. He had nearly bankrupted the core hospitality division. They wanted to publicly sever all ties. Owen came to me begging for a way to save his father's dignity." Eleanor shook her head, taking a slow step back. "No, that is not true. He negotiated a graceful exit. I negotiated it," I corrected her coldly. "I created the chairman emeritus title out of thin air. It is a completely meaningless designation. And that $20,000 a month. It does not come from the Blue Alder Family Trust. The trust is locked up. That money comes directly from a secondary shell company funded by my own operating revenue at Northvale. I have been paying your husband a $20,000 monthly allowance out of my own pocket, just so he does not look like a disgraced, fallen executive leeching off his son." The color drained entirely from Eleanor's face. The aristocratic arrogance vanished, replaced by the hollow, wide-eyed look of a woman watching her entire reality fracture. Still, the instinct to protect the family facade was deeply ingrained in her. She gripped the edge of the counter, trying to find her footing. "Even if that is true, Violet, even if it is, he is your father-in-law. We are a family. Family must be forgiving. You do not just humiliate a proud man because you had a disagreement. You have to look past the numbers and show some grace." "Grace is exactly what I have shown for 11 years, I replied, my voice chilling the air between us. "But grace is a voluntary gift. Eleanor, Grant decided to demand it as a right, while simultaneously insulting me. I will not let emotional blackmail overshadow the balance sheet anymore. The bank is closed. She left shortly after, unable to formulate another argument against the undeniable weight of the black binder. The house was quiet again until exactly 8 o'clock that evening. Owen walked through the front door looking as though he had aged 5 years in a single day. He dropped his briefcase in the hallway, loosened his silk tie, and walked straight to the living room bar cart to pour himself a heavy glass of bourbon. He took a long sip before he finally looked at me sitting on the sofa. "Violet, please tell me you are going to fix this. My phone has not stopped ringing all day. Dad is absolutely frantic. He will survive," I said, not looking up from the legal pad in my lap. "It is not just about him throwing a tantrum over his country club access," Owen pleaded, walking over and sitting heavily on the edge of the coffee table, placing himself lower than me in a subconscious display of supplication. "He is in the middle of a very important deal, a major new venture. If his accounts start bouncing right now, if he loses his liquid credibility, it is going to look incredibly bad for him. Just turn the spigot back on. We can discuss his behavior later, but right now, you are going to ruin his deal." I stopped writing. I slowly raised my head and looked directly into my husband's exhausted eyes. My mind, trained by decades of corporate strategy and risk assessment, caught the discrepancy instantly. Grant Whitaker was a narcissist who threw tantrums when he did not get his way. But Owen was describing a man who was frantic, a man who was terrified. A $20,000 lifestyle allowance was a lot of money for dinners and golf. But it was not enough to capitalize a major new venture. It certainly was not enough to make or break a legitimate corporate deal. Unless, of course, that monthly deposit was the only verifiable liquid income he had to show a private lender. Or unless cutting his access to the family accounts had inadvertently blocked him from tapping into something much larger and far more dangerous. Grant was not just angry about losing his spending money. He was panicking because a vital cash flow had just been severed, and he was suddenly choking on a lack of liquidity. "A major deal," I repeated, tasting the words carefully. "Funded by what capital, Owen? I know exactly what his assets look like. I know what the trust looks like. He has no leverage." Owen rubbed his temples, letting out a long, defeated sigh. "I do not know the details, Violet. I swear I do not. I just know he's been working on something huge for months. Just fix the accounts. Please, do it for me. Just to keep the peace." I looked at the man I had married. He was weak, caught endlessly between his loyalty to a toxic father and his reliance on a capable wife. He wanted to close his eyes and pretend the fire alarm was just background music. I stood up, towering over him as he sat on the low table. I made sure my voice was loud enough to fill the entire room, sharp enough to cut through any remaining illusions he harbored. "I am done buying peace, Owen," I said firmly. "I am done funding the delusions of a man who despises me, and I am certainly done doing it in the dark. So here is exactly what is going to happen. You are going to decide right now where your loyalties lie. Either you stand by the truth and you support the absolute boundaries your wife laid down today, or from this moment forward, every single thing between us will be handled like a corporate contract rather than a marriage." Owen stared at me, his glass of bourbon suspended halfway to his mouth. "Choose carefully," I added, turning to walk up the stairs. "Because I enforce my contracts." Owen did not pack a bag, but he did not sleep in the primary bedroom either. When I came downstairs the next morning at 6 o'clock, I found him sitting in the exact same spot on the sofa, nursing a fresh cup of coffee. He looked at me with bloodshot eyes, still clinging to the desperate hope that I would magically soften overnight. "Violet, please," Owen started, his voice raw and thick with exhaustion. I talked to him again. "He is just trying to put together a final comeback. That is all this is. He has been working on a luxury wine brand and a boutique resort real estate project down south. He wants one last win before he actually retires. If you just unlock the accounts, he can finish the capitalization phase. Do not take this away from him." I paused at the bottom of the staircase. A luxury wine brand and a resort real estate project. In the commercial hospitality sector, An undertaking of that specific nature required an initial liquid injection of at least $5 million just to secure the land options and the licensing. Grant did not have $5 million. He did not have $500,000 in unencumbered assets. His personal balance sheet was a barren wasteland of leveraged properties and maxed-out credit facilities. A final comeback, I echoed softly, walking into the kitchen to pour my own coffee. And who exactly is underwriting this grand venture? Owen. Because no institutional bank in the country would lend him a single dollar without a rock-solid guarantor. Owen rubbed his face, avoiding my direct gaze. I do not know the exact syndicate structure. He said he has private equity guys lining up. He just needs his operational cash flow to look healthy for the diligence period. He was lying, or worse, he was willfully ignorant. Private equity firms did not care about a $20,000 monthly allowance. They cared about collateral. They cared about verifiable equity and hard assets. I left Owen sitting in the living room and drove straight to my office at Northvale. I bypassed my morning meetings, locked the heavy glass door of my suite, and booted up my encrypted terminal. I had maintained top-tier administrative access to the Blue Alder Resort's internal network ever since I restructured their debt covenants 4 years ago. It was time to see exactly what Grant had been doing while everyone thought he was just playing golf. I opened the Master Information Technology Access logs. I started filtering the data from the past 90 days, looking for unusual server pings originating from Grant's Internet Protocol address or anyone directly associated with his remaining skeleton staff. For the first hour, it was just standard traffic. Then, I noticed a cluster of secured document retrieval requests routed through an old legacy portal. My pulse steadied into a slow, rhythmic drumbeat. Someone had been accessing the digital archives. Specifically, they had bypassed the standard operational files and dug directly into the executive legal repository. I traced the digital footprints. They led straight to a series of high-resolution, unredacted scans of my personal signature. These were the exact signature pages from the master restructuring agreements I had signed years prior. There was absolutely no legitimate business reason for anyone to view those specific files today. I dug deeper, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I cross-referenced the user identification codes. The requests had not been made under Grant's login. They had been executed by his former executive secretary, a woman who still held a mid-level administrative role at Blue Alder. Over the span of 3 months, she had quietly submitted internal requisition forms to the corporate archiving department. I pulled up the itemized list of what she had requested. The inventory made the blood run cold in my veins. She had asked for certified copies of the primary land titles for our 2 most profitable coastal properties. She had requisitioned the unredacted board meeting minutes from the past 2 quarters. Most damning of all, she had pulled the official capital contribution certificates, the very documents that proved the tangible equity I held within the organization. Grant was not just building a fake profile to impress his country club friends. He was harvesting the heavy artillery of corporate collateral. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct extension of Marcus, a senior accounting manager at Blue Alder, whom I had personally recruited straight out of his master's program. Marcus was loyal to the numbers, and by extension, he was loyal to me. Marcus, I need you to answer a question, and I need you to do it without logging it in your daily report, I said the moment he picked up the line. Good morning, Violet. What do you need? His voice immediately dropped to a hushed, professional tone. Has Grant Whitaker contacted your department at any point in the last 8 weeks? There was a heavy pause on the line. I could hear the faint sound of Marcus closing his office door. Yes, he has. It was highly unusual. He invited me to lunch twice. He kept asking very roundabout, hypothetical questions regarding the unallocated reserve cash flows. He also wanted to know the exact ceiling on the revolving credit facilities that are directly linked to your name and your Northvale guarantor status. Did you give him those numbers? I asked, my voice dangerously soft. Absolutely not, Marcus replied quickly. I told him that information was strictly compartmentalized and required your direct authorization. He played it off as a casual inquiry for a historical audit he was doing for his memoirs. But Violet, he was pressing hard. He specifically wanted to know how fast a drawdown could be approved if an emergency acquisition presented itself. Thank you, Marcus. If he reaches out again, you are to notify me instantly. I disconnected the call and sat in the absolute silence of my office. The puzzle pieces were snapping together with terrifying precision. Signatures, land titles, credit limits. Grant was not writing a memoir. He was building a shadow portfolio. It was time to bring in a hunter. I opened my private contact directory and dialed Nia Mercer. Nia was a forensic compliance expert. We had worked together during a hostile takeover 3 years ago. She had a mind like a steel trap and a complete disregard for corporate pleasantries. She specialized in finding the money that people spent their entire lives trying to hide. Violet Parker, Nia answered, the sound of a busy Manhattan street echoing behind her. To what do I owe the pleasure? I need a shadow audit. Nia, immediate priority, I instructed, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the mahogany desk. I need you to run a deep dive forensic trace on Grant Whitaker. I want every limited liability company, every shell corporation, every blind trust he is connected to. I have reason to believe he is utilizing internal Blue Alder documents and potentially my forged signature to construct a fraudulent collateral package. Send me the access logs and the requisition lists you have, Nia said, her tone shifting instantly into predator mode. Give me 48 hours. What is the working theory? He has been using the chairman emeritus title I gave him as a legitimate corporate shield, I explained, the reality of my own mistake tasting like ash in my mouth. He is taking that fake title, combining it with stolen internal documents, and going out into the private equity market to raise capital for a wine and resort venture. He is projecting the illusion that the entire Whitaker family wealth and my operating group is backing him if he is signing guarantees based on assets he does not control. He is committing federal wire fraud, Nia stated flatly. I will start pulling the uniform commercial code filings and the mezzanine debt registries immediately. I will let you know what I find. I ended the call and stood up, walking over to the expansive window overlooking the city. The morning fog was finally burning off, revealing the hard concrete angles of the buildings below. For years, I had viewed my father-in-law as nothing more than a nuisance, a loud, arrogant man clinging to a bygone era. Requiring a monthly stipend to keep him quiet and compliant, I thought I was simply managing a difficult family dynamic. But as I stared out at the skyline, a chilling realization washed over me. I had not just cut off an arrogant old man's pocket money. By freezing his accounts and stopping his monthly disbursements, I had inadvertently stopped the only clean liquidity he had. I had just cut the oxygen line to a massive, highly illegal financial scheme. And when a drowning man realizes he is out of air, he does not just sink quietly. He grabs onto whoever is closest and tries to pull them down with him. Grant was out of air, and I knew with absolute certainty that he had already tried to tie the anchor around my neck. It was exactly 7 days later. Eleanor had insisted on a mandatory Sunday family dinner at the main Whitaker estate, a sprawling, aging mansion in Medina that smelled of beeswax and fading relevance. She had summoned Owen and me under the guise of mending broken fences, desperately trying to force the family back into its comfortable, polished mold. I attended only because I wanted a front-row seat when the inevitable explosion occurred. We were gathered in the formal living room. The antique grandfather clock had just struck 7 o'clock. Grant was conspicuously absent, having allegedly stepped out for a late afternoon meeting at his club. Then, Eleanor's cellular phone rang. The sudden noise shattered the tense silence in the room. She glanced at the screen, her perfectly plucked eyebrows knitting together in confusion. She muttered that it was an unknown number from Arizona and pressed the green button, holding the device to her ear. "Hello?" Eleanor said, her tone dripping with practiced, polite apprehension. "Yes, this is Eleanor Whitaker. Who is calling?" The room was quiet enough that I could hear the faint, metallic cadence of a man speaking on the other end. Whatever he said, it caused the blood to instantly vanish from Eleanor's face. She swayed on her feet, her hand gripping the back of a velvet armchair so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I am sorry. What did you just say?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Owen stood up immediately, sensing the structural collapse of his mother's composure. He crossed the Persian rug in 3 long strides and snatched the phone from her hand. He put it on the speaker setting, holding it out so the voice echoed through the vast, quiet room. "This is Owen Whitaker," he barked, his corporate defense mechanism engaging. "Who the hell is this, and why are you upsetting my mother?" "Mr. Whitaker, my name is Arthur Vance," the voice replied. It was a cold, clinical, and completely unsympathetic baritone. "I am the distressed asset attorney representing Mesa Crest Special Assets out of Scottsdale, Arizona. I am calling as a courtesy before we file the formal commercial liens tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Owen shot a panicked look at me. I remained perfectly still, seated on the edge of the sofa, letting the forensic web Nia and I had unraveled play out in real time. "Liens for what?" Owen demanded. "For the outstanding obligations of your father," Arthur Vance stated, each word landing like a hammer blow on a glass table. "Mr. Grant Whitaker signed a $2.8 million bridge note with our firm. To inflate the value of his loan file and secure the disbursement, he utilized the name of Ms. Violet Parker as a silent guarantor, along with pledging a substantial portion of the physical collateral belonging to Blue Alder Resorts." Eleanor let out a sharp, choked gasp and sank heavily into the armchair. She looked like she might actually lose consciousness. "That is impossible," Owen shouted, his voice cracking. "My father does not have the authority to pledge those assets, and my wife certainly did not sign any guarantee. This is a scam. You are trying to extort us. I assure you, Mr. Whitaker, this is a highly documented legal reality," the lawyer countered smoothly, completely unbothered by Owen's outburst. "Would you like me to verify the collateral schedule he pledged the coastal acreage? Specifically, parcel code 497 Bravo and parcel code 620 Delta. He also provided certified copies of the internal board meeting minutes dated the 14th of November and the internal file update logs from just 3 weeks ago. We have the digital signatures. We have the capital contribution certificates." Owen stared at the phone in absolute horror. The lawyer had just recited the exact list of confidential documents I knew Grant's former secretary had pulled from the archives. "Your father missed his first balloon payment on Friday," Arthur Vance continued, his tone devoid of any mercy. "Due to the aggressive structure of this specific note, the loan is now in a state of cross-default. If we do not receive a comprehensive settlement or a verified wire transfer by tomorrow afternoon, the lender will initiate immediate asset seizure. We have the legal authority to freeze the operational revenues from your 2 flagship resort properties. I suggest you locate Mr. Whitaker and secure competent counsel. Good evening." The line went dead. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was the sound of an empire hitting the ground. Owen dropped the phone onto the coffee table. He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading, begging me to tell him this was a misunderstanding, a terrible prank, anything but the truth. But he saw the cold, uncompromising knowledge in my expression. I already knew. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice cutting through the panic like a scalpel. Owen scrambled for his own phone, dialing Grant's number. It went straight to voicemail. He tried the country club. The club manager informed him that Grant had left hours ago. For the next 8 hours, Grant Whitaker became a ghost. The house descended into absolute chaos. Eleanor wept hysterically in the study, mourning the sudden, violent death of her social standing. Owen paced the length of the living room, making frantic calls to the corporate legal team, trying to understand how a bridge note he knew nothing about could suddenly threaten the lifeblood of Blue Alder Resorts. I simply sat by the fireplace, drinking a glass of sparkling water, waiting for the rat to return to the sinking ship. The panic spread through the estate like fire catching on dry drapes. Every unanswered call, every passing hour, ratcheted the tension higher. Grant had strapped a bomb to the family trust, pulled the pin, and vanished. It was nearly 3 o'clock in the morning when the heavy front doors finally unlocked. Grant walked in. He smelled faintly of stale cigar smoke and top-shelf liquor, though he was not drunk. He looked disheveled, his tie undone, the manufactured confidence of the chairman emeritus completely stripped away. Owen lunged at him the moment he stepped into the foyer. "Where the hell have you been?" "Do you have any idea what is happening?" A lawyer from Arizona called. "They are going to seize the resorts. Dad, $2.8 million. What did you do?" Grant put his hands up, adopting a defensive, patronizing posture. He looked at his son, then at Eleanor, who had emerged from the study, and finally, his eyes locked onto me. "Everyone needs to calm down," Grant said, his voice attempting a soothing resonance that failed miserably. "It is just a temporary cash bridge. That is all. It is a standard mezzanine financing tool. I am closing a high-class, exclusive business opportunity down in Scottsdale, a luxury syndicate. It is going to triple our liquidity by the third quarter." "You used my wife's name!" Owen screamed, the reality of the betrayal finally breaking through his lifelong conditioning. "You stole internal documents. You pledged collateral you do not own." "I borrowed them," Grant snapped back, his temper flaring. "Because I built that company. I have equity in the ground those resorts stand on. And it was all completely under control." He pointed a shaking finger directly at me, his face contorted into a mask of pure, venomous blame. "It was under control until she deliberately sabotaged me," he snarled. "The only reason the balloon payment failed, the only reason we are in technical default, is because Violet vindictively froze my operational accounts last week. She cut off the exact liquidity stream I was using to service the debt interest. She caused this collapse. If she had just kept her mouth shut and authorized the transfers, none of this would be happening." He stood there, a 70-year-old man facing total ruin, confidently blaming the woman he had stolen from for not letting him steal enough. Eleanor looked at me, a flicker of desperate hope in her eyes, wondering if perhaps Grant was right, wondering if I was the villain who had ruined the family. Owen stood frozen, his mind unable to process the sheer audacity of his father's logic. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend myself against the absurd accusation. I just stared at him. I looked past the tailored suit, past the graying hair, past the legacy he constantly paraded around, and in that quiet, frozen moment, I finally understood the fundamental truth of our 11-year relationship. Grant did not hate me because I came from a middle-class suburb. He did not hate me because I lacked an elite pedigree or because I was an outsider infiltrating his prestigious bloodline. He hated me because I was the only person in his entire life with the financial literacy to see through his illusions and the absolute willingness to let him fall. He hated me because I was the boundary he could never manipulate, the wall he could never charm his way through. He realized, looking into my eyes at 3 a.m, that the era of unconditional rescue was officially over. I was not going to save him. "Are you finished?" I asked quietly. Grant blinked, thrown off balance by my total lack of outrage. "Because tomorrow," I said, picking up my purse from the armchair, "we are going to have a very different kind of family meeting. Good night, Grant." I arrived at the Northvale corporate headquarters at exactly 4 o'clock on Monday morning. The building was completely empty, save for the overnight security detail in the lobby. I bypassed my usual routine, locked my heavy office door, and booted up my encrypted terminal. Nia Mercer had promised me a full forensic breakdown, and at precisely 4:15, a heavily secured file dropped into my private inbox. The subject line was completely blank. The attachment was a 90-page dossier that unspooled a financial disaster far more grotesque than a simple unpaid loan. I opened the executive summary. Grant had not just stumbled into a bad commercial real estate deal. He had been completely consumed by a vanity project located in Scottsdale, Arizona, operating under the name Cask and Canyon Society. The prospectus described it as an ultra-exclusive enclave for the high-net-worth individual. It boasted a private vintage wine club, an elite equestrian event center, and a tiered luxury membership structure designed specifically to flatter the egos of men who possessed far more money than actual sense. But the true architect of this desert mirage was not my father-in-law. The dossier quickly introduced a woman named Sabrina Vale. Sabrina was 32 years old, armed with a degree in public relations and a lethal, predatory understanding of male vanity. Nia had pulled her professional background, revealing a distinct pattern of attaching herself to aging, formerly powerful corporate executives who were desperate to prove they were not past their prime. Sabrina provided the youthful glamour, the sharp modern aesthetic, and the illusion of a cutting-edge business venture. Grant provided the capital, or rather, he provided the illusion of infinite capital. I scrolled down to the financial mechanics of the Cask and Canyon Society, and a cold, heavy knot formed in my stomach. Arthur Vance, the distressed asset lawyer who had called the estate, had referred to the debt as a bridge note. He had lied by omission. Nia had tracked the actual disbursement schedules. This was not a standard commercial loan. It was a predatory, multi-tiered merchant cash advance deliberately disguised as mezzanine financing. Grant had signed a series of aggressive promissory notes that allowed the lenders to siphon funds almost continuously. The interest was not calculated annually. It was compounding weekly. There were staging fees, massive late penalties, and cross-collateralization clauses buried so deep in the fine print that only a seasoned forensic auditor would spot them. Grant had willingly walked blindfolded into a financial meat grinder, arrogantly convinced he could outsmart the operators. The longer the debt sat, the tighter the mathematical noose became. I clicked to the next section of the dossier, labeled External Communications and Investor Relations. This was where the sheer audacity of Grant's betrayal truly surfaced. Included in the file was a master pitch deck that Sabrina and Grant had been actively circulating to secondary private equity firms. On slide 14, under the bold heading of Corporate Backing and Financial Security, there was a high-resolution photograph of our flagship coastal property. Directly beneath it, listed as a formalized corporate asset, was a fabricated organizational chart. Grant had listed himself as the senior managing partner. But it was the bottom corner of the slide that made my blood run entirely cold. There, printed in crisp, professional typography, was my name, Violet Parker. Next to my name was a title I had never seen, let alone agreed to silent guarantor and primary liquidity backstop. He had not merely name-dropped me at a cocktail party to sound important. He had codified my financial reputation into a fraudulent investment prospectus. He had weaponized the fabricated board minutes and falsified asset schedules to convince these aggressive lenders that the entire Whitaker family empire, backed by the undeniable liquidity of Northvale Operating Group, was underwriting his Scottsdale fantasy. The implications immediately spiraled far beyond a personal family crisis. I pulled up a blank mental whiteboard and began mapping the corporate contagion. If this $2.8 million default exploded onto the public record, the collateral damage would not be contained to Grant. Blue Alder Resorts operated on highly leveraged vendor credit lines. We relied heavily on a delicate ecosystem of specialized suppliers, independent contractors, and international hospitality partners. If a lien was publicly filed against our two most profitable properties, the corporate credit monitors would flag us instantly. Our premium vendors would immediately demand cash on delivery. Our institutional lenders would call in their covenants to aggressively reassess our risk profile. The brand equity, which I had spent over a decade meticulously rebuilding after Grant's last catastrophic failure, would plummet overnight. A single reckless vanity project in the desert had the severe potential to trigger a catastrophic liquidity crisis across my entire operational board. I needed absolute proof of his intent. I needed to know if he was merely a foolish old man who had gotten completely in over his head, or if this was a calculated, deliberate assassination of my assets. Nia had anticipated this exact requirement. In the final appendix of the dossier, she included a transcript of intercepted communications between Grant and Sabrina Vale, obtained through a discrete cyber trace of the project's primary email server. I read a message dated exactly 6 weeks prior, right when the very first signs of the severe cash crunch must have appeared. Sabrina had expressed acute concern about meeting the upcoming penalty thresholds. Grant's typed reply burned itself permanently into my memory. Do not worry about the default triggers. Grant had written, my daughter-in-law is a cold, calculating machine, but she is utterly obsessed with protecting the Whitaker name. When the margin calls hit, she will complain. But ultimately, she will open her checkbook. She always does. She is our ultimate insurance policy. Just keep smiling for the investors and let me handle the family accounts. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, the stark glow of the computer monitor casting long, sharp shadows across my quiet office. The air in the room felt incredibly still. He had planned it, from the very beginning. Grant knew he could never afford the Cask and Canyon Society. He knew the debt structure was fatally toxic. He had deliberately constructed a massive financial bomb and carefully placed it directly under my chair, entirely confident that my dedication to the family business would force me to defuse it with my own money. He firmly believed I was nothing more than his captive shield. A profound, chilling clarity washed over me. Any residual guilt, any lingering sense of familial duty to Owen's parents, evaporated completely. It was instantly replaced by the cold, surgical precision of a corporate executioner. I picked up my secure phone and drafted a highly confidential message to my elite legal team at Northvale. I was not going to play the pathetic role Grant had written for me. I would absolutely not write a check to Arthur Vance or his predatory lending firm. I would not protect the Whitaker patriarch. My directive was brutally clear. I was going to deploy every legal and financial weapon at my disposal to surgically extract my properties, my personal name, and my operating group from the blast radius. I would aggressively save the tangible assets that rightfully belonged to me. But Grant Whitaker, I was going to leave him tied directly to the exact bomb he had built. I would strip away every ounce of his manufactured dignity, expose his fraud to the people he feared most, and let the financial predators he had blindly invited into our lives devour him whole. I closed the encrypted dossier, picked up my black coffee, and began drafting the absolute terms of his destruction. The emergency family meeting convened at exactly 8 o'clock that evening in the formal dining room of the Whitaker estate. The massive mahogany table, usually reserved for Thanksgiving feasts and displays of hollow aristocratic wealth, now served as a tribunal. Eleanor sat at the far end, clutching a damp linen handkerchief. Her eyes were red and swollen. You just need to pay them, Violet. She wept, her voice a fragile, trembling pitch. Just wire the $2.8 million tomorrow morning and make this nightmare end. We cannot have a lien on the resorts. The country club will find out. The society pages will ruin us. Just settle the debt so we can have peace. Across the table, Owen looked at me. It was the exact same pleading, desperate gaze he had used for 11 years whenever his family created a mess they could not afford to clean up. He wanted me to act as the silent, invisible janitor. I placed my leather briefcase onto the polished mahogany surface. The heavy metallic click of the locks echoing in the cavernous room sounded like a vault sealing shut. I will not wire a single dollar to Arthur Vance or his predatory lending syndicate, I stated, my voice completely devoid of warmth. Paying that extortion blindly does not buy peace, Eleanor. It buys a target on our backs. If I pay off a fraudulent bridge note, I legally validate the premise that they have the right to extort me. It proves to the wolves that we are easy prey. Furthermore, it completely drains our operational reserves, leaving us entirely exposed when Grant inevitably decides to dig a new, deeper hole next month. He will not do it again, Eleanor cried, looking at her husband. Grant sat frozen at the head of the table, his arms crossed over his chest, projecting a false, brittle defiance. He will absolutely do it again, I corrected her sharply. Which is why the era of blind trust is officially terminated as of this exact minute. I pulled out 3 thick bound dossiers and slid one to each of them. This is the new emergency governance protocol, I announced, taking my seat and looking directly at my husband. Page 1 outlines an immediate, unconditional freeze on all family trust expenditures. All discretionary withdrawal privileges are suspended. The corporate credit cards are voided. Grant's monthly allowance is permanently revoked. To fund the massive legal defense we now require to fight off this asset seizure, we are liquidating the vanity assets. Grant, the 3 vintage Porsches sitting in the carriage house will be listed with a high-end auto broker by noon tomorrow. Your collection of Rolex and Patek Philippe watches will be appraised and sold by the end of the week. Eleanor gasped, putting a hand to her chest. You cannot strip him of his personal belongings. Those are his prized possessions. His prized possessions are currently the only unencumbered assets keeping this family out of federal bankruptcy court. I snapped back, not breaking eye contact with Owen. Turn to page 4. Owen, that is a legally binding proxy agreement. You are going to sign over total executive control of Blue Alder Resort's cash flow directly to me for the duration of this crisis. In addition, your current chief financial officer is out. He is either complicit or dangerously incompetent for missing a leak of this magnitude. I am replacing him with a senior auditor from Northvale Operating Group effective tomorrow at 8 o'clock in the morning. Owen stared at the proxy agreement, his face pale. Violet, you are asking me to hand you the keys to the entire company. I am telling you to hand me the keys before the bank changes the locks, I corrected him, my tone entirely flat. You do not have a choice. I finally turned my attention to the head of the table. Grant was glaring at me, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. I slid a separate, single-page document directly in front of him. This is an affidavit of unauthorized disclosure and forgery, I explained, leaning back in my chair. You are going to sign this under penalty of perjury. It explicitly confirms exactly which corporate documents you provided to the lender. It legally states which internal files you authorized your former secretary to access. And most importantly, it contains a legally binding admission that you acted entirely on your own and that Violet Parker never authorized you, under any circumstances, to use her name, her corporate standing, or her personal guarantee on that loan. Grant stared at the piece of paper as if it were coated in poison. Then, the brittle defiance finally snapped. He slammed both of his fists onto the mahogany table. The crystal water glasses shuddered. I will sign absolutely nothing of the sort, Grant roared, rising to his feet. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. You are using a temporary cash flow issue to execute a hostile takeover of my family. You are trying to steal the company I built. You walk into my house, you insult my wife, and you try to humiliate me in front of my own son. You think because you run some sterile operating group you can dictate terms to a Whitaker. You are nothing without the doors I opened for you. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with righteous, fabricated indignation. He truly believed that if he yelled loud enough, the reality of his crimes would simply vanish. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch at his outburst. I simply opened a manila folder I had kept deliberately separate from the governance binders.
You are right about one thing, Grant, I said quietly, the stillness in my voice cutting through his shouting more effectively than a scream ever could. I am going to dictate the terms, but not because of the doors you opened.
Because of the doors you tried to nail shut while I was standing inside. I pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a printed copy of the intercepted email Nia Mercer had secured for me. I looked down at the page and read it aloud, ensuring every single syllable carried clearly across the dining room. Message sent to Sabrina Vale, dated the 14th of last month, quote, do not worry about the default triggers. Violet might hate me, but she will not let the Whitaker name fall. When the margin calls hit, she will complain, but ultimately, she will open her checkbook. She is our ultimate insurance policy. End quote. I placed the printed email face up in the center of the table. The silence that crashed down upon the room was absolute, total, and suffocating. It was not the silence of contemplation. It was the silence of a catastrophic structural failure. Grant's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The furious red flush drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly, old, and incredibly small. The bombastic patriarch had been stripped completely bare, leaving only a calculating, parasitic fraud in his place. I watched Owen. He was staring at the printed email with hollow, unblinking eyes. The illusion he had spent his entire life protecting was dead. He looked at his father, and for the very first time, he did not see a proud titan of industry who had simply hit a streak of bad luck. He saw a ticking time bomb. He saw a man who had intentionally plotted to ruin his own son's wife just to fund his ego. Then, I looked at Eleanor. She was not crying anymore. She was completely still, staring at the man at the head of the table. The painful, devastating truth had finally pierced through her walls of denial. The person who had pushed her beloved family over the cliff, the person who had orchestrated their total destruction, was not the cold, calculating daughter-in-law from the suburbs. It was the man sitting right next to her. The man she had spent 40 years believing was their unshakable pillar. "Sign the proxy, Owen," I commanded, my voice breaking the silence with the cold snap of a judge's gavel. "And Grant, pick up a pen. We are going to be here until every single line is inked." No one dared to argue. For the very first time in 11 years, there was no debate, no pleading, and no defense. I owned the room. We landed in Phoenix at 10 o'clock in the morning. The dry heat of Arizona was a stark contrast to the damp chill of Seattle. Nia and I had boarded the early flight without uttering a single word to Grant or Owen regarding our itinerary. Grant, currently stripped of his corporate privileges and confined to his estate under the new governance protocol, was effectively neutralized. I needed him completely blind to my maneuvers. If he knew I was sitting down with his creditors, his fragile ego would inevitably compel him to intervene and detonate whatever leverage I was about to build. At exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Nia and I walked into the sleek, glass-paneled offices of Mesa Crest Special Assets in downtown Scottsdale. Arthur Vance sat at the head of a long, polished concrete conference table. He was flanked by 2 junior associates who looked like they specialized in intimidating small business owners. Arthur stood up, offering a tight, predatory smile that suggested he fully expected me to open my checkbook and dissolve into tears. "Ms. Parker," Arthur said, gesturing to the empty leather chairs opposite him. I must admit, I anticipated a wire transfer this morning, not a personal visit. I hope you understand the gravity of the impending liens. I did not sit immediately. I placed my briefcase on the table and unlatched it. "Mr. Vance, let us dispense with the theatrical intimidation. I am not a panicked relative scrambling to protect the family honor. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Northvale Operating Group, and this is my Forensic Compliance Director, Nia Mercer. We are here to discuss the structural integrity of the garbage paper your firm currently holds." Arthur's smile vanished. He slowly sat back down. "The note is ironclad. $2.8 million, in default, backed by hard corporate collateral." Nia took her seat and began distributing sleek black folders to Arthur and his associates. "If by ironclad you mean riddled with federal compliance violations, then yes," Nia said, her voice sharp and professional. "Let us review your underwriting standards, shall we?" I took my seat, letting Nia set the cadence. "Turn to page 3 of our forensic review," I instructed. "Your firm originated this loan utilizing an aggressively inflated collateral schedule. You accepted property valuations for the Blue Alder coastal parcels that were 40% higher than their current market appraisal. You did this to justify a larger principal disbursement. Furthermore, your origination documents failed to disclose a hidden broker fee of 15%, which was immediately kicked back to a third-party limited liability company." Arthur shifted slightly in his chair. "Those are standard mezzanine structuring fees. Your father-in-law signed the disclosures." "My father-in-law signed a lot of things," I countered, leaning forward. "Which brings us to the chain of authorization. You accepted heavily redacted internal board minutes as proof of his authority to pledge Blue Alder assets. You did not request a certified corporate resolution. You did not require a medallion signature guarantee. You simply took the word of a man whose primary title was a fabricated honorary designation. He presented himself as the senior managing partner, one of the junior associates interjected, trying to sound authoritative. And you failed to conduct basic due diligence to verify that claim, I fired back, locking eyes with the associate until he looked away. I turned my attention back to Arthur. But the most egregious failure of your underwriting department is the reliance on a concept you termed a silent guarantor. I opened my own folder and pulled out a single, heavily notarized document. I slid it across the concrete table toward Arthur. That is a sworn affidavit, signed under penalty of perjury by Grant Whitaker less than 24 hours ago, I stated, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. In it, he explicitly confesses to fabricating my involvement. He admits that he utilized my name, my corporate standing, and my financial reputation entirely without my knowledge or consent. Violet Parker never signed a single page of your loan documents. Violet Parker never verbally agreed to backstop this debt. If you attempt to file a commercial lien against my properties based on a forged guarantee, you are not merely executing a bad debt. You are actively participating in federal wire fraud. Arthur read the affidavit carefully. The confident, predatory aura he had projected over the phone completely evaporated. He was a lawyer who specialized in bullying distressed borrowers, not in fighting billion-dollar operating groups equipped with forensic evidence of lending malpractice. Even if the guarantor status is contested, Arthur said slowly, carefully choosing his words, Grant Whitaker still owes us the principal and the accrued interest. He signed the promissory notes. He did, I agreed smoothly. And he is currently sitting on a collapsing vanity project. Speaking of the Cask and Canyon Society, my intelligence indicates your secondary collateral is also evaporating. I nodded to Nia, who pulled up a digital file on her tablet. We received confirmation this morning, Nia announced, her tone almost conversational. Sabrina Vale is actively shopping her equity shares in the project to a rival developer in Phoenix. She knows the venture is entirely insolvent. She is preparing to abandon the project before the end of the week. The grand syndicate Grant promised you is already dead. Arthur closed the black folder. He looked at me. Realizing the power dynamic in the room had completely inverted, I was not there to defend Grant. I was there to dismantle Arthur's leverage. What is your proposal, Ms. Parker? He finally asked, the hostility replaced by weary pragmatism. I am going to offer you a single, non-negotiable exit strategy, I said, folding my hands on the table. If you proceed with filing liens against Blue Alder Resorts, I will immediately tie your firm up in federal litigation for the next 5 years. I will expose your undisclosed broker fees and predatory lending practices to the Arizona State Attorney General. You will spend more on legal defense than the principal of this loan, and you will ultimately recover absolutely nothing from me. I let the threat hang in the air for a heavy second before delivering the alternative. Or, you accept a restructured settlement, I continued. I will purchase the paper on this debt at a steep discount, ring-fencing your immediate losses to a manageable level. We will settle the outstanding balance for exactly $800,000. In exchange, you will completely release Blue Alder Resorts and my name from any and all liability. You will rewrite the debt instrument to assign sole, unshielded, personal liability directly to Grant Whitaker. $800,000 does not even cover our initial cash outlay. Arthur protested, though his voice lacked conviction. It covers what you can realistically extract before this entire fraudulent structure collapses, I corrected him. To fund this settlement, Grant is currently liquidating his personal vintage automobile collection and his luxury timepieces. You will receive the wire transfer the moment those assets clear escrow. You get your recovery, and you get a clean exit from a toxic file. Arthur stared at the concrete table for a long time. He ran the risk calculus in his head. He knew his loan file was a compliance nightmare. He knew facing Northvale's legal team in court would be a financial bloodbath. And he knew Sabrina Vale jumping ship meant the underlying real estate play was doomed. We will need the release documents drafted by 5 o'clock today, Arthur finally conceded, his voice tight with defeat. My legal team is already formatting the paperwork, I replied, standing up and closing my briefcase. An hour later, Nia and I walked out of the air-conditioned office building and into the blinding Arizona sunlight. The dry heat felt remarkably cleansing. "That was surgical," Nia noted, adjusting her sunglasses as we walked toward the waiting town car. "You basically just bought his debt for pennies on the dollar and handed him the bill." "I did not buy his debt," I corrected her, sliding into the back seat of the car. "I bought my absolute freedom from his leverage." I had not flown to Scottsdale to play the role of the dutiful, deep-pocketed daughter-in-law, throwing millions of dollars into a furnace to save a toxic patriarch's pride. I had gone to purchase control of the entire chessboard. By paying a sharply negotiated fraction of the demand, I had successfully severed my name and my corporate assets from the catastrophic mess Grant had meticulously built. I had fortified my castle, and I had deliberately left Grant Whitaker completely exposed outside the gates, solely responsible for the wolves he had invited to the door. The return flight from Phoenix landed shortly before midnight. I did not instruct my driver to take me to the Mercer Island estate. Instead, I had him drop me off at the Northvale Operating Group headquarters. The building was dark, silent, and perfectly suited for the task I needed to complete. I had successfully neutralized the immediate threat of the Arizona lean, but a seasoned corporate strategist knows that stopping the external bleeding is only the first phase of survival. I needed to ensure the internal digital corridors of Blue Alder Resorts were completely sealed before dawn. I sat at my desk, the glow of my encrypted monitor cutting through the dark office. I initiated a global keyword sweep across the master executive servers. I was looking for any remaining backdoors. Grant or his former secretary might have left open. It was a standard forensic protocol. But as the progress bar slowly filled across the screen, a cold, nagging instinct compelled me to adjust the search parameters. I added Owen's administrative inbox to the sweep. For 11 years, I had operated under the fundamental belief that my husband was simply weak. I believed he was a passive victim of his father's overbearing personality, a man who desperately wanted peace but lacked the spine to demand it. I thought he was blind to the true extent of Grant's manipulations. The search algorithm finished its sweep at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. It flagged a heavily buried email thread dating back nearly 4 months. I opened the first message. It was from Grant to Owen, sent from a disguised external address, detailing the preliminary stages of a temporary financial channel he was attempting to open outside the official corporate banking structure. My pulse slowed to a steady, heavy rhythm as I read Owen's direct reply. "Dad, I saw the draft board minutes you requested from archiving yesterday." Owen had written, "You are treading very dangerously here. If you are going to leverage the coastal properties to secure this temporary channel, you have to be careful not to trigger Violet's internal audit flags. You know how strict she is with the covenants." Grant had replied. An hour later, "Do not lecture me on covenants. Just keep her distracted with the Northvale acquisitions. I might need to lean on her guarantor profile to push the underwriting through faster, but it will be strictly silent. She will never know." And then, the final, devastating response from my husband. "Just keep her name out of the primary filings unless you absolutely have to. If this blows up, it is going to be a nightmare to manage her reaction." I stared at the screen until the black text seemed to blur into the stark white background. Owen knew. He did not know the catastrophic magnitude of the $2.8 million bridge note. He likely did not know about the compounding weekly interest or the predatory structure of the merchant cash advance. But he absolutely knew that his father was operating a shadow channel. He knew about the altered corporate minutes. He knew Grant was parading physical assets to secure outside capital. And most damning of all, he knew there was a severe risk that his father was relying on my personal name to underwrite the fraud. He had seen the red flags waving violently in the wind, and he had deliberately chosen to look away. He did not warn me. He did not stop his father. I sat back in my chair, the leather creaking softly in the quiet room. The entire complexion of the crisis instantly shifted its color. This was no longer just a bitter, high-stakes war between a resentful father-in-law and a capable daughter-in-law. This was the silent, absolute collapse of marital trust. Owen had allowed me to walk into a financial minefield. In his mind, he had rationalized the betrayal with a simple, cowardly logic. He figured that if Grant succeeded, the family would enjoy the spoils. And if the venture exploded, as it inevitably did, Violet would simply step in and save them. I had rescued them so many times before that my husband had subconsciously factored my financial martyrdom into his risk assessment. I was not his partner. I was his premium insurance policy. A sharp, familiar pain flared in my chest, but I did not cry. There was no sudden outburst of weeping, no dramatic collapse. The betrayal was revealed through the cold, hard data of a server log, and my reaction mirrored that sterile environment. The emotion was compressed, packed down tightly into a dense, unbreakable resolve. I highlighted the entire email thread, exported it to a secure, offline flash drive, and permanently deleted the access logs to cover my tracks. I would not confront him tonight. If I showed my hand now, Owen would panic, apologize, and attempt to manipulate my remaining sense of duty. I needed to hold this final, fatal strike in reserve until the exact moment when there was absolutely no avenue for retreat. As I prepared to log off for the night, a new encrypted message appeared in my Northvale inbox. It was from Nia Mercer. The subject line simply read, "Supplemental audio file." I clicked the attachment. It was a digital audio recording Nia had managed to scrape from the Scottsdale Project's internal communication portal. It appeared to be a voicemail Grant had left for his public relations manager, Sabrina Vale. Roughly 3 weeks ago, Grant had delivered his message, but had failed to properly disconnect the call on his mobile phone before turning to speak to an unidentified associate in the same room. The audio was crisp. I could hear the faint clinking of ice cubes against crystal. "Are you sure about the daughter-in-law?" the unidentified associate asked, his voice muffled but entirely decipherable. "If we hit a cash crunch on the final phase, are you certain she will cover the shortfall? She seems like a tough operator." Grant let out a sharp, dismissive laugh that sent a chill straight down my spine. "Violet is a machine." "Yes," Grant replied, his tone dripping with a relaxed, arrogant cruelty. "But she is a machine with a very predictable psychological flaw. You see, she comes from nothing. She married into the Whitaker name, and she spends every waking hour trying to prove she deserves to be here. It is actually quite simple. The more I dismiss her, the more I belittle her and treat her like an absolute outsider in front of Eleanor and Owen, the harder she works to buy her way in. She will clean up this mess just to force me to acknowledge her value. I have her perfectly trained." The recording ended with a sharp digital click. I sat in the dark for a long time, hearing his voice, hearing the sheer, calculated malice behind 11 years of carefully orchestrated insults, fundamentally altered something inside my brain. I did not feel the fiery, consuming rage I had felt when the Arizona lawyer first called the house. The anger simply evaporated, leaving behind a vast, frozen clarity. Grant Whitaker did not just despise me. He had weaponized my own desire for family harmony against me. He had used his cruelty as a deliberate management tactic, and Owen had stood by, watching the psychological abuse happen, perfectly content to let his wife be emotionally battered as long as it kept his father's bank account solvent. Every single illusion I held about this marriage shattered in that exact moment, falling to the floor like a pane of heavy glass hitting concrete. There was nothing left to salvage. There was no misunderstanding to clear up, no therapy that could bridge this divide. I closed my laptop and slid the flash drive into my pocket. When I drove back to the Mercer Island estate as the sun began to rise, I was operating under a completely new paradigm. I was no longer interested in merely putting out the immediate financial fires Grant had started. Dousing the flames was a temporary measure. As long as the framework of the Whitaker family remained intact, they would eventually find another way to burn me. I walked through the front door of my house with a final, irreversible plan. I was going to tear down the entire structure of the estate. I was going to systematically dismantle their leverage, sever every legal and financial tie, and rebuild a fortress where no one could ever use my name or my loyalty. as collateral again. I stepped out of the private elevator and onto the top floor of the Blue Alder Resort's headquarters at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. I did not go home to rest. I bypassed my usual morning briefing and walked straight into the executive suite. The air conditioning was running high, keeping the environment crisp and sterile, exactly the way I needed my mind to be. I immediately instructed my executive assistant to issue 2 mandatory summons. The first was an emergency session of the Blue Alder Corporate Board of Directors, scheduled for 5 o'clock that evening. The second was a closed, highly classified session of the Whitaker Family Trust, mandated to begin in the exact same room at 7 o'clock. There would be no escape clauses tonight. There would be no convenient scheduling conflicts. I locked down the heavy oak doors of the primary boardroom and spent the entire afternoon transforming it into a courtroom. I arranged the seating with deliberate, psychological precision. I took the chair at the absolute head of the long mahogany table, a position historically reserved for Grant. I placed Owen directly to my right, Eleanor to my left, and relegated Grant to the far opposite end, physically isolating him from the center of power. Then, I laid out the executioner's tools. Directly in front of my chair, I stacked the forensic accounting report compiled by Nia Mercer. Beside it lay the freshly notarized settlement agreements from Arizona, proving that I held the absolute rights to the debt he had created. Next to that, I placed a newly printed, color-coded spreadsheet. It detailed every single $20,000 monthly transfer I had made over the past 11 years. Beneath it was a timeline graphic I had commissioned, drawing a direct, undeniable line showing how Grant had used that exact phantom income to fabricate his credibility with the Scottsdale lenders. I had mapped out every lie, cross-referenced with bank statements and his own intercepted emails. But my preparations did not stop at Grant. I slid a sleek, black manila envelope onto the table directly in front of Owen's designated leather chair. Inside that envelope were the printed email chains I had downloaded the previous night, alongside internal corporate server logs and the draft board minutes his father had manipulated. It was absolute, undeniable proof that my husband had seen the red flags of his father's financial treason months ago and had willfully chosen to look the other way. As I finalized the documents, I reviewed a final devastating piece of leverage my legal team had finalized that afternoon. The $20,000 monthly allowance was not merely a mechanism to feed Grant's ego. Because he had demanded absolute secrecy to preserve his pride, the funds had been routed from a Northvale subsidiary as an independent contractor consulting fee. However, Grant, in his boundless arrogance and belief that he was entirely untouchable, had never bothered to file the corresponding tax schedules. He had collected $20,000 a month for over a decade without declaring a single cent of it to the federal government. What began as an honorary perk designed to save his dignity had quietly metamorphosed into an ironclad trap of tax evasion. He owed taxes on over $2.5 million of undeclared income. If he tried to fight me, if he dared to claim I owed him anything, I would simply hand his ledger over to the federal revenue authorities. The corporate board members arrived at 5 o'clock, voted unanimously to formally accept the emergency financial proxy I had demanded the night before, and quickly vacated the premises, leaving the room heavy with anticipation. At exactly 7 o'clock, the family arrived for the closed trust session. Eleanor walked in first. She was wearing her signature pearls and a soft cashmere wrap, her face washed clean of the previous night's mascara stains. She offered me a fragile, hopeful smile. In her mind, the fact that I had returned from Arizona and called a meeting meant that the crisis was averted. She genuinely believed I had simply paid the extortion money, smoothed over the rough edges, and chosen to preserve the sacred family unity. Grant strolled through the double doors a moment later, entirely misreading the atmosphere. The panicked, shrinking old man from the night before had vanished. He was wearing a sharply tailored navy suit, projecting the aura of a reigning monarch who had just weathered a minor peasant uprising. He looked at the neatly arranged dossiers on the table and actually smirked. He mistakenly assumed I had spent the past 48 hours cleaning up his mess. and that all he needed to do now was offer a few hollow, patronizing words of gratitude before everything returned to his preferred status quo. Then, Owen walked in. Unlike his parents, Owen did not look relieved. He looked like a man walking toward a firing squad. He knew me better than anyone else in the room. He knew that my silence was never an indicator of peace. It was the sound of a predator holding its breath before the strike. He took his seat to my right, his eyes immediately dropping to the black manila envelope resting silently on the polished wood in front of him. He did not touch it. He did not even reach for his glass of water. His hands were shaking. "Thank you for handling the administrative friction in the desert, Violet," Grant began, his voice booming with forced, jovial authority as he took his seat at the far end of the table. "I know tempers ran a bit hot yesterday, but at the end of the day, we are a family. We protect our own. I am sure whatever small settlement you had to authorize will be easily recouped by the fourth quarter." I did not smile. I did not nod. I simply placed both of my hands flat on the mahogany table and looked down the length of the room, meeting his arrogant gaze with eyes like crushed ice. "Let us make one thing absolutely clear before we open these files," I stated, my voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls with a cold, terrifying resonance. "I am going to resolve the entirety of this crisis tonight, in this exact room, within the next hour. I am going to dictate the terms of our survival, and I am going to dismantle the liabilities that have threatened my operating group." I paused, letting my gaze drift slowly from Grant to Eleanor, and finally coming to rest on my husband. "But you need to understand the fundamental condition of this resolution," I continued, my tone dropping into a register that commanded total obedience. "After tonight, none of you will ever have the right to demand that I bear the consequences of your actions in the name of family loyalty again. The era of unconditional rescue is dead. Tonight is not a negotiation. It is a sentencing." Grant's smug smile faltered. Eleanor's hand flew up to clutch her pearls, the fragile hope shattering in her eyes. Owen simply closed his eyes, his breathing shallow and rapid. The atmosphere in the boardroom compressed, growing so heavy it was difficult to draw breath. The silence that followed my declaration was chilling, absolute, and suffocating. It felt exactly like the static charge in the air right before lightning strikes a dry forest. Everyone sitting at that table suddenly understood that the old, comfortable order they had exploited for 11 years was about to suffer a violent death. They just did not know yet who was going to be buried underneath the rubble. The internal counsel for Blue Alder, a sharp corporate attorney named Thomas, sat at the corner of the table, his gold pen hovering over a fresh legal pad. I activated the projector at the far end of the room. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout. The truth is always most devastating when delivered with absolute, unwavering calm. First, I distributed the physical evidence to Thomas and the board representatives who had stayed behind. I laid down the falsified board minutes. Next went the pitch deck from the Cask and Canyon Society, clearly displaying my name boldly listed as the silent guarantor. Then, I distributed the intercepted emails from Sabrina Vale confirming the impending insolvency of the Desert Project. I followed that with the aggressive terms of the predatory loan. And finally, the color-coded spreadsheet documenting exactly how the $20,000 monthly allowance had been systematically weaponized to create a facade of legitimate wealth. Grant tried to interrupt, his face flushing dark red. "This is a gross misrepresentation of my executive strategy." I silenced him entirely by pressing play on my laptop. The audio recording of Grant's voice filled the cavernous boardroom. It was the voicemail where he gleefully explained his psychological strategy of manipulating me through sheer contempt, openly boasting that treating me like an outsider would always force me to clean up his financial messes just to prove my worth to the family. Eleanor buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking silently as the reality of her husband's cruelty echoed off the wood-paneled walls. Grant slammed his fist on the table, trying to drown out his own recorded voice. Everything I did, every single risk I took, was to restore the Whitaker name. I was trying to rebuild the empire that was stolen from me by cowards. I did it for this family. I did it for Owen. Did you really? I asked, my voice cutting through his bluster like a surgical blade. I pulled the final document from my master file and slid it directly across the table to Thomas. Read the addendum on page 4 of that schedule. Thomas? Thomas adjusted his glasses. Scanning the dense legal text, his eyes widened in shock. This is a transfer of proxy. It appears Grant secretly routed 30% of Owen's projected future voting shares into an intermediary limited liability company controlled exclusively by Grant himself. The entire room jolted. Owen's head snapped up, his eyes wide with profound betrayal as he stared at his father. Grant had not been building a legacy to pass down to his son. He had been quietly cannibalizing Owen's future to ensure he remained the absolute dictator of a crumbling empire. Owen finally understood that he was not a cherished heir. He was merely a convenient instrument to be used and discarded. I did not give them time to recover. I turned my leather chair to face my husband directly. And now, we address your role in this tragedy. Owen, I said quietly. Owen swallowed hard, the remaining color draining completely from his face. Violet, I swear to you, I did not know about the debt structure or the stolen voting shares. You did not know the exact figures, I corrected him, pulling the black manila envelope from in front of him and opening it. But you absolutely knew he was opening a shadow financial channel. You knew he had requested the unredacted corporate minutes. You knew he was likely using my name to bypass the underwriting process. I have the server logs and the exact email thread where you explicitly told him to keep my name out of the primary filings so I would not find out. You saw the red flags burning brightly, and you chose to walk away. Owen reached out, his hand trembling over the table. I thought he had it under control. I thought if it went wrong, you would just step in and fix it like you always do. You thought I was your premium insurance policy? I stated coldly. You sacrificed my financial security and my professional reputation just so you would not have to stand up to your father. That is not a marriage, Owen. That is a hostage situation. I placed 2 separate, heavily bound folders onto the mahogany table directly in front of him. I am giving you 2 choices, and you will make your decision right here, right now. I instructed. The folder on your left is an ironclad post-nuptial agreement. If you sign it, you permanently surrender your executive seat on the board. You forfeit all automatic access to Blue Alder Capital, and you legally accept that every single asset, account, and subsidiary attached to Northvale Operating Group is entirely separate and untouchable by you or anyone in this family in perpetuity. Owen stared at the folder as if it were rigged with explosives. And the other folder, he whispered. The folder on your right contains fully finalized separation papers, I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of sorrow. I watched him. I watched the man I had spent 11 years supporting. I waited for him to furiously reject the separation, to instantly grab his pen and sign the postnuptial agreement to prove that our relationship meant more to him than executive power or his father's approval. But Owen hesitated. He looked at the postnuptial agreement, rapidly calculating the loss of his prestige, the loss of his automatic wealth, and the harsh reality of living completely under my financial governance. He sat there in agonizing silence for 10 full seconds. That hesitation was the absolute, undeniable answer I needed. A man who truly loves his wife does not need to calculate the cost of keeping her. The marriage had been dead long before this boardroom tribunal. The Arizona loan was merely the final autopsy. I reached out, placed my hand firmly on the post-nuptial agreement, and pulled it away from his reach. I then slid the separation papers directly into his trembling hands. Sign them, I commanded. Owen looked up at me, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes as he realized the catastrophic magnitude of what he had just lost. But he did not argue. He clicked his pen and signed his name on the dotted line, ending 11 years of empty promises. I turned my attention back to the far end of the table. Grant was watching the destruction of his family with a look of stunned, hollow terror. Your turn, Grant, I said, sliding a final stack of documents down the polished wood toward him. You are going to sign a permanent, irrevocable resignation from any and all association with Blue Alder Resorts. You will immediately surrender all remaining voting rights. You will liquidate your vintage cars, your watches, and your personal portfolios tomorrow morning to settle the exact $800,000 debt I negotiated for you in Scottsdale. Grant opened his mouth to protest, but I raised a single finger, silencing him instantly. Furthermore, I continued, sealing his fate. You and Eleanor are vacating the Medina estate by the end of the month. The property will be sold to inject liquid capital back into the core hospitality division. You will be relocated to a modest condominium. There will be no more $20,000 allowances. There will be no more borrowed honor. You will receive a strict, deeply audited living stipend that I will personally approve on the first day of every single month. If you step out of line, if you ever attempt to leverage the Whitaker name again, I will submit your undeclared tax ledger to the federal authorities and let them seize whatever scraps you have left. Grant picked up the pen. His hand shook so violently he could barely form the letters of his own name. He signed every single page, entirely broken, stripped of the grand illusion he had guarded so fiercely for decades. I gathered my files, locked them securely inside my briefcase, and stood up from the mahogany table. The air in the room felt incredibly light, cleansed of the toxic residue that had suffocated me for over a decade. I did not offer any parting words of comfort or false sympathy. I simply turned and walked out of the boardroom. As the heavy oak doors closed behind me, I stepped into the brightly lit executive corridor with absolute control over everything that rightfully belonged to me. Blue Alder Resorts would be aggressively restructured under a clean, modern model. Northvale Operating Group was fully insulated, surgically detached from the rotting anchor of the Whitaker family. The man who had spent 11 years claiming my marriage was his biggest regret, would now spend the rest of his life surviving on a meager, heavily restricted stipend dictated by the very woman he despised. And Owen, sitting in the ruins of his father's ambition, was left to realize far too late that the woman they had constantly treated as an unworthy outsider was the only load-bearing pillar keeping their entire world from collapsing. Thank you for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment below with your city or country so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to Olivia Revenge Stories, hit the like button, and do not forget to click the hype button so this story can reach and empower even more people.